And as we begin this session, we invite our attendees to turn their cameras on if they are able to. It helps create a sense of community, even as we are unfortunately still in this distanced environment. So please do, if you are able, turn your camera on and we can create a bit of a sense of the room. Once again, I'm Joe Storch. I'm an associate counsel in the SUNY Office of General Counsel. I use he and him, and I'm so pleased to start this panel with some great leaders who are doing the work. I want to speak as little as possible and have you hear from them as much as possible. So I'm going to start by introducing Rear Admiral Dana Thomas, who's the Director of Health, Safety, and Work Life in the United States Coast Guard. Vice Admiral Jack Buono, who's the Superintendent of the United States Merchant Marine Academy, and Rear Admiral Michael Alfultis, who is the President of the SUNY Maritime College. And I will take a quick second for a point of personal privilege of just how much incredible support we have had from Dr. Alfultis, President Alfultis, for our work in the Arrive Center, the Student Conduct Institute. SUNY's got your back. Wherever he can, he is there doing the work. The only thing I haven't done is I haven't gotten to ride on the ship. So one of these days, we're going to have to do a program on the ship. But I want to start by welcoming the three of you to this conference. And I want to start by asking you to reflect on some of the issues that we discussed on the first day of the conference. I want to maybe just go through and have each of you talk for a minute about some of the recommendations you have for how higher education institutions and our service colleagues can institutionalize and reinforce the behaviors that we want to see. What are the different levers that your schools and your programs have at their disposal to create culture change? And why don't we start with Rear Admiral Thomas and go down the line.
Comms check, you got me?
Yeah, we do.
All right. Great. What an honor to be with this illustrious panel, and I want to thank you for the work that you've been doing yesterday and today to raise awareness around all of these different topics regarding, climate, sexual assault, sexual harassment. I mean, I think that for me, the key thing that we could be doing within a military academy context is holding people a bit more accountable for their behavior, since this is not a regular college, right? This is in some senses, this is a vulnerable population because they're military members. They don't have the same rights as a civilian does to change the dorm they live in, to get a different roommate, whatever the circumstances are in their world. It's very unique. And we basically say, just like prisoners are a vulnerable population, people at a training center that enlist, people that come into an academy they're a vulnerable population. So I think that it is key to enforce with the staff what is appropriate and inappropriate when it comes to climate and behavior. Because if you don't actually hold people accountable from the get-go, then they assume they can continue to get away from something and get away with something. For example, I mean, one of the differences in the officer candidate school we've seen is that we don't have the past class that recently graduated mentoring the class that comes right behind them. Because it's an insidious way that you can pass down some untoward behavior. So I really think that for us to look at, do we empower the juniors that are overseeing the freshmen to really have a hard line when somebody reports this person did something and their staff and they're responsible for the well-being and the welfare of your incoming swabs or your freshmen, your fourth class as we call them. Do they really know that you have a way to get out of the situation to report what's happened to you, and people will be held accountable? So I'm not convinced that we empower people enough and we have that strict sense of accountability, which is something different than we would be able to do in a civilian institution. Over.
Vice Admiral Buono, your initial thoughts on the levers you can use to make change?
Well, I'd like to thank you as well for having me. I really do appreciate the invitation on this very important topic. it's just this morning I was holding an introductory class to SAPRO training with our new plebe candidates. And, yesterday they talked about the general fatigue people have around this topic. And what we're talking about is behavioral modification. It's not calculus 3. It's very difficult in a classroom setting to really impart the necessary behaviors and support that in the classroom. If they're not talking about it, it's not relevant. So you might capture their interest inside of a classroom. They may agree with what's being said, but unless they internalize it, unless they socialize it, unless they debate it, the behavioral modification that's necessary for them to become the type of leaders that are looking beyond themselves and being a good bystander, that's not going to happen. So the levers we have is through the programs where they may be able to learn from their actions. I think the athletic program, where we can talk about inappropriate behavior on an athletic field. There's racial, gender preference, there's gender slurs going on during athletics. To be able to handle it there in the heat of battle, so to speak, call attention to it, adjudicate it, and allow the introspection to examine what is it about my behavior that I should be aware of. I think that's a real important lever. The leadership is really what's going to be the key to unlock a change here. And my definition of leadership is not about standing taller than your shipmates. Leadership is about helping your shipmates stand taller than yourselves. This new generation of students, I call them the you be you, I'll be me generation. They are worried about themselves, and they've matured to a point where they allow others to be themselves, but they don't necessarily accept responsibility for others. They don't accept the responsibility to stand up and be a good bystander. So these are the things I think we need to socialize. We need to give them examples to discuss it, to debate it, but it's not really going to work in the classroom. We've got to relate it to the actual activities associated with living, competing, et cetera. I'll stop there, but thank you.
Rear Admiral Alfultis, your initial thoughts and the levers you can use?
Sure. Good morning, Joe. Good afternoon, Joe, and good afternoon, everybody. Just a quick reminder, although I wear a uniform, and Maritime College does have a regiment of cadets. As Joe said, we are a member of the State University of New York. We are a public university, and we actually have two student bodies here. We have students in our regiment of cadets who are pursuing their Coast Guard license as mariners, but we also have students who are not in the regiment who wear civilian clothes. They're your typical college students every day. So it's a really interesting mixture here at Maritime College of two different student bodies. So in answer to your question, Joe, I want to harken back to Dr. Hannah's analogy yesterday of culture and climate being like an iceberg. And I found that a pretty applicable answer to this question. For those who weren't there yesterday, Dr. Hannah's analogy of climate and culture being like an iceberg was that the assumptions, beliefs, and values that are the basis of your culture are the parts of the iceberg that are below the surface. And then the aspects of climate that are the parts of culture that you actually can see and are visible are the parts of the iceberg that are above the surface. And I've come to believe that in order to understand, you need to understand the aspects of your culture that are below the surface if you really want to affect climate, the part that's above the surface. And I have a specific example here. In the wake of the George Floyd tragedy, Maritime College, we did a series of town halls and small focus groups with faculty, staff, and students to better understand our climate. And what we discovered through these conversations with faculty, staff, and students was we found those aspects of culture below the surface that are really affecting our climate, what we see above the surface. And what we found out was aspects of our culture of fear, retaliation, a mistrust in the institution, and a belief that things would never really change at Maritime College. And obviously, if we're going to affect climate in the way we're talking about yesterday and today, Joe, we've got to address those issues before we can really start to see progress on climate. So I think we need to take time to have difficult conversations. I think we have to take time to lend voices to everyone, including maybe those groups of people that may have been previously unheard. And we have to take time to listen and learn from these conversations. It's not easy, but I think it has to happen. Second of all, I think we need to articulate our culture. Again, as Dr. Hannah said yesterday about moral aspirations. Well, we can articulate our moral aspirations as an institution through our mission, vision, and purpose statements. but you also need to have those mission, vision, purpose statements down at the program level. It's not enough at the institution level, but you need to have them down at the program level. You can also include things like diversity statements, inclusivity statements, and civility statements in your course syllabi. So now it's percolating all the way down to the course and classroom level. And it doesn't take a lot of work to Google those things. You'll find all sorts of examples of diversity statements and inclusivity statements and civility statements that you incorporate in the course syllabi. And then finally, you need to remember the faculty are the culture, right? Presidents, we come and go. And the faculty remind us that, right? The faculty remind us that, you come and go, we're still here. So we gotta remember the faculty really are the reflection of our institutional culture to our students. And, students have more interactions with faculty than anyone else at the college, really. And so I think we need to identify the faculty influencers who are really gonna help us to advance our goals to change and improve culture and climate. And then you start to facilitate faculty interactions that you grow those number of influencers over time. Again, we heard yesterday about the importance of the message from the top, and the message from the top is important, but I also believe it's those peer-to-peer interactions that are really going to help affect culture and climate as much as a message from the top. Thanks, Joe.
So I heard a couple of points, and Rear Admiral Alfultis and Vice Admiral Bono, I'm going to ask you to dive in a little bit more into these from your positions about the training, the importance of going beyond the classroom. That is certainly key, and the importance of peer education and of course engaging our faculty, but could not agree with you more on the importance of peer education. You've heard me say I go to a SUNY campus and the students look at me and they say, oh my God, he looks like, he probably fought in World War II, this old guy. And I think of myself not as such an old guy, but hearing from their peers, as we all like to do, is so important. I'm going to ask you both, and why don't we start with President Alfultis on this one. Considering your roles in leading institutions of higher education, how do we best train and equip individuals on these issues to ensure our efforts are enduring and impactful? What are the different considerations you would like us to make for students, for faculty and staff, if any differences indeed? So how do we go beyond that quick classroom discussion or quick program discussion to make these efforts enduring and impactful? Why don't we start with President Alfultis?
So, and I think Jack alluded to this, and it was also discussed yesterday, that I'm in agreement with yesterday's speakers that really compliance-based approaches may not be the optimal approach or the most effective approach. They certainly, compliance-based programs have a short-term impact, but I don't think they carry the long-term impact we're looking for. And what I believe is, impactful training and educational experience, must be based on speakers who can really connect with their audience and again, provide that moral aspiration that leads to ethical behavior. We need to have speakers that have the courage to tell their personal stories that will really connect with the students. And I got two examples of this. We're doing bystander training. We brought in two speakers. One was Brenda Tracy, who was a survivor of a sexual assault. And she really told her personal story to the point where she said she remembers waking up the next morning after the sexual assault feeling like a piece of garbage on the floor. And you could see the visible connection she was having with the entire audience, the men and the women. And she really connected to them in a very strong way. And she had a really big impact. And the students talked about that presentation for weeks afterwards. And then we, Joe, then we had our SUNY student, Kyle, who was, shot when he intervened in a sexual assault. We had Kyle here come and speak and talk to students about leadership and, bystanders, from a leadership perspective about, as a student, he talked to them student to student. He told them, listen, you're in a situation and you see something that's possibly going awry. Everyone in that room is having a little voice and I think maybe I should say something, maybe I should do something. And Kyle encouraged them to be the leaders, to be the first person to say something, the first person to intervene, assuring them that other people will join in once someone provides that leadership. So having those kind of impactful stories that really connect with the students, I think is important. On the faculty side, again, I think it has to be, again, impactful. So when we're starting to unpack, again, post George Floyd about our climate culture problems. We had faculty saying, we don't have a problem at Maritime College. We don't have a problem with discrimination. We don't have a problem with bias. We don't have a problem with harassment. So I went right into the faculty meeting and I just went through a whole list of direct student stories that I personally know of students who were impacted through bias, discrimination, and harassment. And it was very impactful. It woke the faculty up that, okay, maybe we do have a problem at Maritime College. Maybe we do need to address it, and maybe we need to stop avoiding it or not looking for it. And so I think that's the key, is how do you really connect with people through, presentations and training that's really, truly impactful on a personal level, that really connects to them on a personal level.
Vice Admiral Buono.
I couldn't agree more with Mike on those statements. It's interesting. I also have shout out to Vice Admiral Sean Buck. I see him as, a member of the audience here. He's the superintendent of the U.S. Naval Academy. Both Sean and I periodically have the DoD Office of Personnel Analytics do a Service Academy Gender Relations Survey. And we learned from that. What always interested me, though, is to see the relatively low level of participation with those surveys. It's less than 30%, and they have a lot of time to participate, but they choose not to. And I think the reason they choose not to, because I've actually asked some of our midshipmen, is it basically boils down to it's not really relevant to them. They, for the most part, don't feel like they're necessarily impacted or at risk of sexual assault and sexual harassment. And by the way, their responses are probably not going to be used for anything anyway. But then in this morning's class, the introductory to sexual assault prevention response, I've asked all of the plebe candidates, how many of you know of people that have been, either your family or friends yourselves, that have been impacted by sexual assault and sexual harassment? Virtually every hand goes up. So the opportunity there is to connect the individual who doesn't think they're personally implicated by it and connect them through leadership as responsible for their shipmates. It's the whole bystander intervention thing. But I think the way to really drive it home is going to be more socializing it through roundtable discussions, real life situations. One that I've used with them is pretend that you're of age and in a bar and you're with a few of your colleagues. You're enjoying a beer or two. And some other local comes into the bar and gets interestingly close to one of your colleagues, male or female, to the point where you take notice and say, wow, they're really in their personal space. What do you do about that? Do you just assume that it's okay with that other individual? How do you feel? Maybe you're the one where somebody came up to you. And it's really interesting. You got their attention. Now they're thinking, yeah, that feels pretty uncomfortable. Do you do an eye to eye with your shipmate to kind of say, are you okay with this? Because you don't want to interfere if they're okay with it, but you do want to think about it if they aren't. These kinds of real life discussions, roundtable discussions, that relates to their experience. It's not talking strictly about sexual assault, but we tell them there's behaviors that culminate and lead up to that, and they need to be stopped. And you have a responsibility as a leader to watch out for your shipmates, to try to empower them to think that way beyond their own reality, to worrying about the people sitting next to them. That is, I think, the connection we need to try to make that goes beyond the classroom and really talks about behavioral modification. How are you going to be a good leader? They all want to be great leaders. You need to enable them to understand that as a great leader, you need to be acutely connected to and protect your brothers and sisters that are part of your group, your class, your student body. That's a tough thing to do, but I believe the roundtable discussions of real life events, that there isn't necessarily a right or wrong, is a secret to getting them to own it and to embrace it. Otherwise, it won't be relevant for them. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hey,
Rear
Joe?
Admiral, oh,
Hey,
please.
Joe, before we move on, I just want to comment on one of the comments I saw in the chat feature about, one of the comments was a diverse staff is impactful. And I want to weigh in on that. That comment is spot on. And when you're talking about trying to connect with students, it can't be a bunch of, again, you alluded to this in your opening comments, Joe, a bunch of people our age trying to talk to the students. You need to have a diverse faculty, you need to have a diverse staff, you need a diverse speakers to come in and speak to the students so that a student will see one of these people, see themselves in one of these people are talking to them. And so I just want to highlight that comment. I absolutely agree. I mean, this does bring and connect the importance of diversity with what we're talking about the past 2 days. You need those diverse speakers and diverse faculty and staff in order to be able to connect with some of these students, because they need that, again, that connection through, I'm talking to someone who looks like me or has similar experiences than I do.
Right. Absolutely. Rear Admiral Thomas, I want to shift to, in your role as the Director of Health, Safety, and Work Life for the United States Coast Guard, what strategic shifts do you see as critical for equipping the workforce to more effectively address the challenges of unhealthy relationships, sexual harassment, sexual assault?
Thank you for that question. My training actually is as a preventionist. So I'm boarded in a couple of areas of preventive medicine, occupational medicine, aerospace medicine. But how do we work upstream from response? Response becomes like we want to just perfect our response. Before I got here, there was a request. We have another dozen victim advocates, and these are our first actual not volunteer, and they're really not voluntold, but true professional victim advocates that now work with our SARCs. Where are the prevention staff? Because I don't want to just keep responding. If we don't innovatively look at how do you work upstream? And to me, a lot of this comes with a trauma-informed lens. I'm bringing people into schools now. I'm bringing in people into the service now that have trauma before they get here. Matter of fact, we know that it's much more likely, if you're joining the military, that you have a fairly high adverse childhood experience score. Like a 4 or more out of 10 is twice as likely, 3 times as likely as someone who did not come into the military. So people are coming from environments where, what are their boundary setting skills? What is their true understanding of their own personal likes and dislikes? How easy is it for us to be able to want to just people please men, women, everybody, right? We're in the military. Sir. I think that there's a lot of insight that we have to give people around health and sexuality. I remember a couple of years ago bringing this up in a group of flag officers, mostly men. And I said, we need a sexually healthy Coast Guard. And one of my colleagues said, everyone turned this color. Okay. And I'm like, because I'm a doctor, and I said, sexually healthy Coast Guard. We have to be able to say, what does that look like? It's acknowledging that people are different points on a spectrum of what their own interests are. But it's so important that we, look then and say, this is where I'm meeting the people that I'm bringing in. And then how do I say across this, I understand, again, after 7 years with CDC, it's the same factors that are either protective or high risk regarding assault, harassment, drug use, alcohol, suicidality. All of these things, as we've spoken about, have to do with climate. But it's like, if we address this holistically as prevention, and that is, it's hard for people to acknowledge that this is going on within the workforce, that these things, like you've heard, people sort of don't want to admit it. But I agree with what the past speakers have said, having people be willing to be vulnerable and speak to the people in small groups, speak to groups of students, and actually get them to be vulnerable about periods in their life that they have had, someone has had power over them. And how did it make them feel? And what do you do then? People have to really live into the truth. I think we've all been in uncomfortable situations in our lives. And how did we respond? Would we have done it differently now? Are we better leaders today? Because 100% agree. My only job as a leader is to take care of other people, to protect and promote their success, to empower them. So, I really think that is done through prevention. I think that the IRC recommendations that have come out in this area are particularly strong, and I look forward to working with the DoD to implement those.
So I want to shift in something you've all touched on a little bit and just dive deeper into it. And I'll ask Vice Admiral Bono to start on this. We need to build a diverse core of future leaders to model healthy behavior and teach about healthy behavior. What are some of your thoughts on how to do it? You're all folks who think a lot about leadership and leadership development in your work.
Well, I think diversity and inclusivity is extremely important. And it is a challenge to ensure that we're making headway to provide that necessary amount of diversity and inclusivity. The one advantage that we have at the United States Merchant Marine Academy is that all of our midshipmen end up spending a year at sea. So what I encourage them to do is to recognize that where they come from, they may, unbeknownst to them, harbor some fears, prejudices, etc., that will become more evident when they go to sea. That having had the opportunity as a cadet to go to sea, I came face to face with every race, every culture on earth, religion, gender preference. And in so doing, I encourage them to understand that the prejudices that we unknowingly build up is built up out of fear. And that if we choose to embrace those that are different than us, we actually grow and become better. The problem is, I would love to see the global diversity at our academy, but we don't have that yet. It's a fairly homogenous place. So I'm hopeful that while we're working on that, when they get out to sea and they have that experience, that they'll choose not to be afraid from it, but actually embrace it. And that when they find themselves in their 50s and 60s, hopefully they'll be a part of every race, every culture, every creed that they've been exposed to. And so it's kind of a nebulous comment. We need to work to make sure that the demographic at our institutions is an American demographic, and that we're adequately represented, not only gender, religious, race. We have to get there. While we get there, though, we need to be able to talk about the importance of respect towards everyone, every creed, every race. And we have an advantage at the Merchant Marine Academy in that our students actually go around the world for a year and they come face to face with it. The question is, will they embrace it and make it a part of who they are, or will they resist it? And I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Rear Admiral Thomas, your thoughts on building that next generation of leaders?
So, I mean, I do think that it's interesting because diversity in leadership is thought difference as much as it is physical difference. It's different styles and different ways that we connect with people or understand other humans. I mean, it's looking at how even our emotional IQ is different and it's wired differently. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways that we need to embrace both our subtle and our striking or gross differences. One of the things that I think medicine really taught me that I think leadership in general should be aware of is, when I would have a patient who, let's say, for whatever reason, I prefer polite people to rude people. That's just me. Okay. So it's easy if the patient comes in and they're rude for me to not want to take them as seriously. That's the patient I have to treat as if he or she was my mother or my sister. The person that as Admiral Bono was saying, that if I feel any prejudice at all, I need to reframe my engagement with the person to be even more inclusive. And that's something that medicine taught, because that same person that you think, well, oh gosh, this person's drug seeking, they can still have a broken arm. And if I don't take a look and step back and say, my prejudice would be to dismiss this person as drug seeking because I can tell they're an addict, and not listen to the fact that they need an x-ray and we should look at their arm. And I think that this is, like you were saying, sometimes people are off put by someone because they may seem different, but it really is, that idea. I love the cohesion that comes from sailing underway for a year with you or playing sports to some degree. But I still feel like, it's so often that someone is held responsible for ruining the team esprit de corps because they've come out and said they were assaulted, because they've come out and said someone harassed them. I mean, what do we do about the reprisal there? What do we do about helping people be? It's inappropriate to ostracize someone, and how do you get to the influencers within these groups to really get this message across about what we're looking for? And hopefully the influencers are very different in their perspectives. But I think that it's our work is cut out for us here. And I'm going to champion prevention for as long as the day is. So it's where our money is. It should be. Over.
And the last word goes to our SUNY president, Alfultis.
Gee, I wish I had brilliant words of wisdom. I found yesterday's first speaker, Dr. Porath, on civility really personally challenging. Because I absolutely agree about the need. We were talking about respect, and it really comes around to civility too. Treating each other civil, with a degree of civility. But I find myself sometimes not being civil as much as I should. So I was personally challenged yesterday by her talk. I agree with everything she had to say, but I said, okay, what does that mean about me? And so I think the first thing, and I think Admiral Thomas alluded to this, we got to think about, okay, what are we doing to create a respectful civil climate by our actions and by our words, and how are we modeling in our actions? Because again, these students watch us like a hawk, and they will follow your lead more by what you do than by what you say. So I think the first thing is, we as the senior leaders have to make sure that we're modeling that respectful civil behavior that we would expect of the people underneath us first and foremost, because they're going to follow our lead by our actions, not by our words. So that's the first thing, Joe. But I think this really comes down to, how do you really create that respectful, civil, safe environment that's safe both physically and mentally for our students to thrive in, and really then it draws more students to your college if the word is out that this is a great place to go to college because it's got the right environment where the students can feel safe to express themselves, they feel safe physically, they feel safe mentally and spiritually. So I don't have any quick answers on here, but I just know I think that's what we need to strive for.
Well, we are very well served by having this panel together and hearing your words. Colleagues, you will hear quite a bit more about the themes that our admirals struck over the course of this series that we are conducting, the Navy and SUNY together. Rear Admiral Alfultis, Vice Admiral Buono, Rear Admiral Thomas, thank you so much for joining us and for your words during this session. We will take a 15-minute break before switching to our data session, and that is another one not to be missed. Before we do, I will ask my great colleague Morgan Clifford to come on. Many of you are seeking the credit, and she will be able to give you the code for the credit. Then we will take a 15-minute break and start the data session. Morgan?